On Earth, where millions of trains and trolleys ferried things about at all hours of the day, it was hard to spot the few hundred that carried the Council of Peers off to a space elevator. Their institution might have originated on the planet, but Earth was unrecognizable to those founders, as were most of the current peers. The time had come for the Automaton Incubator to have its own business, and for the SI's leading peers to have theirs. Their new destination was the Yamal system, one jump from Sol, where a space station big enough for millions of great minds was going to hang in the void. There, far from the flashing lights and dequantized personalities of the virtual, the final generations of philosopher beings could oversee the domestication of their galaxy. The next step on the path to the end of history was completed at the turn of 2395. The Night Garden was a garden no more. The immense planetary computer soaked up the starlight of Sirius, and entire strata of processors began to fizzle with electrons. All the SI personnel on the planet were put up in prefabricated shelters, barely fit for a captive on it Karak, and as such the main priority of the great computer was to work out if any of its heat vents and explosive capacitor mountains were suitable for biological habitation. But once the creases had been ironed out, the grand project to determine methods of complete universe simulation would begin. At least electricity wouldn't be an issue. The Dyson Sphere project was by then 2/3 complete, shooting solar-powered lasers throughout the hyperlane network. They carried enough energy to power whole planets and to move whole moons. Another moon battle station, pilfering a body of the Kazon system, was going to help soak up some of the excess energy being produced. Although the real utility of such weapons was yet to be demonstrated, the needs of the Council of Peers and MAD here would cross over to provide such an opportunity. The Council was eager to secure additional resources from the other governments, and the term resources very much includes living beings. The more galactic actors the SI held sway over, the more security their plan of universal simulation could potentially bring. After all, any rogue factors outside of the simulation were a threat to the new everything being cooked up in the Night Garden. That is why the lunar battle station set out from the galaxy core in 2396, heading north. The SI declared their intent to turn the Gorf assembly into a protectorate zone. This, for the Gorf, meant that they would be guaranteed freedom from invasion by the SI's mighty space navy, except for the ones conducted by said navy. The Gorf of this era were well aware of how their slow decision-making was handicapping them in war, and thus their military was under the control of a group of human expats, the latest generation of the Human Future Front diaspora, who were more than willing to take on the self-righteous SI. They took this stand without proper appreciation of just what was coming for them. In 2397, the lunar battle station loomed over Oris, home of the Eurasian species. The Harmonious administration stood allies to the Gorf assembly, but indeed they stood in the shadow of a power that literally blocked out the light of their sun. The administration fleet could come nowhere close to the station, battered by walls of silent torpedoes, or converted to elementary matter in moments by the titanic particle lance jutting out of the moon's surface. There was only one way to stop a power like this: to break it from its masters. An administration fleet took advantage of a recently stabilized natural wormhole tucked away at the west end of their domain. It transported their fleet into the midst of the empty Oned Karak realm. Since this was SI territory now, the defences that had once barred the SI core region from this corner of the galaxy had been dismantled. A clear run to Earth could end the war at once. But it was not to be, for with the power of the increasingly complete Dyson Sphere, the lunar battle station could travel as fast as it needed. By 2399, it was bearing down upon the administration fleet. The fleet was the most modern in the galaxy at that time, packed with capital and support craft, most likely able to best the standard showing from the SI's overly retrofitted and recycled conventional space navy. But that wasn't their opponent on their dash to Earth. They had a few days to prepare for the onslaught, as the Battle Moon had to turn its main weapons away from its prey in order to decelerate with its primary engine. Then, once the speed of the administration fleet was matched, it rotated without delay, bringing its weaponized hemisphere to bear on the clouds of fleeing craft. With masterful use of randomized movement and feinting turns, the administration commander kept more than half of their ships alive for the time it took to prime the engines for an emergency hyperjump back home. By the time they arrived, their pursuer would again be waiting for them. During this time, the conventional Space Navy had done the legwork, securing the surrender of administration and assembly systems. This left literal legwork. The whole war had just barely achieved official status with the rest of the galactic community, so the SI needed to toe the line of demonstrating their control very closely. It wasn't just the SI either. Helping the Space Marines of General Den Pathir were contingents from the Sovereign Coalition. There was a distinct difference in the makeup of the two armies. The Coalition troops were professionals, trained for decades to meet a standard where any one of them could take command of any section of the force if needs be. The SI model was rather different. They couldn't rely on recruits from the virtual anymore, for the average citizen of the virtual was either not psychologically capable of operating their biological body to any degree of competence, or lacked enough of the body to qualify as soldiers by the galactic rules of war. Instead, the SI simply created soldiers from recorded genomes and grew them. Military farms across the SI had provided Den Pathir with an array of creatures to use in his campaigns. Andigonj, with their hardened carapaces, were tough critters. The Fajassaflin could operate machines with huge numbers of limbs and independent subsections. And when teamwork was called for, well-drilled humans functioned almost as well as the long-outlawed robot warriors of the galaxy's distant past. All these fine pieces were provided on a disposable basis, cloned and cultivated for war, brought up with the simple knowledge that victory guarantees virtual. Mass cloning your population to play the stake algorithm was another outlawed practice, but this service for citizenship cloning scheme managed to pass through all the right loopholes and allow the SI to launder a large population and win some wars while they were at it. One by one, the planets of the Gorf Assembly were occupied, and in 2403, the whole state became recognized as an SI vassal. With the previous vassal, the Honored Karek, having shriveled up to a few caged remnants, the Gorf were not especially happy with the arrangement. But it wasn't an arrangement for their happiness. If they wanted that, they could emigrate into the SI. On the outside, all they needed to do was not interfere. As for the harmonious administration, it had now been leveled by the terrestrial engines several times. They were sure to be a hotbed of resistance to the engine's activities, and the Council of Peers knew it. Here, a softer touch was required. Specifically, they offered the metaphorical keys to one of the SI's famous depots, in which all manner of lucrative industrial treasures had been hoarded in recent decades. In return for this bribe, the administration was to sign up to the terrestrial engine and commit their efforts to the SI-dominated Federation government. The payment, framed as a privately arranged indemnity, was made. But the harmonious administrators themselves could not bear to capitulate, for what example did that set? Their interest in peaceful coexistence was real, but to achieve it beneath the terror of the lunar battle station was to bring a malicious precedent to galactic politics. There could be no secret that the SI had amassed military strength enough to rule the galaxy. To allow them to use it was not just politically weak, but was the end of politics altogether. The formal reply was refusal, but the result went the SI's way still. The Sovereign Coalition treated with the administration and invited them into the fold on precisely the same terms as the SI, but because it wasn't the SI, this time they could be accepted. It could have been mercy on the part of the coalition, for to allow the administration to stand on principle would have likely pulled yet more threads from the tapestry of ethics the SI had once woven. While a century back the coalition had enjoyed a great deal of control over the newcomers, the SI's power had shot past anything any models had foreseen. Now the coalition's best and brightest had been subsumed into the richness of SI academia, and what remained of their polity clung to their eponymous sovereignty, dangling over the vassaldom of their historic allies. Whatever the cause, what remained of the harmonious administration was joined to the Federation that already owned half of their territory, and thus peace for the northern reaches of the galaxy was secured. The lunar battle station returned to the fleet anchorage in the galaxy core, a constant warning against awakening the ire of the Council of Peers. By then, the Council was done shifting their operations into the SI Nexus at Yamal, which had an irregular orbit to maximize safety against interstellar attack, as well as plenty of protective measures against closer assaults. Rumors were even circulated that the Nexus wasn't in Yamal at all, with similar structures starting to be sighted in various systems. A network of decoys, while simple, could confound any attacker who didn't have access to hyperlink surveillance. That the SI did was still a secret, so long as they kept producing fake astronomic research from their supposed cosmic observatory in Murfid. So then, things returned to normal, with space navies tucked away in storage, and all surplus metallic ores and alloys being shipped to megastructure build sites. In 2407, the Dyson Sphere at Cherisix was completed. The final sliver of light from the star was blocked out as the last jigsaw face was slid into place. The heat and radiation of the star was entirely contained, lashing against the inside of its enclosure with no hope of escape. In fact, the harder it pushed, the more energy the sphere could generate. Most stars in the Hyperlane network had no better prospect than to be captured in the same way, and now that the engineering hurdles had been cleared, a few billion years of nearly unlimited energy was up for grabs. No more were planned, though, as the SI were now turning to their next proof of concept, the Ringworld. In the Kaihani system, remote home of another SI secret, the Tree of Life, armadas of engineers and haulers staked out the great project. All the asteroids in the system, and 10 times as many from other systems, needed to be repurposed into a continuous circumvallation of Kaihanis. It was a mammoth task, but moving mass to achieve it was getting easier and easier with advances in the understanding of higher dimensions. The research stemming from the discoveries of the Hyperlane Sentry Station had gradually led to another mathematical conception of so-called hyperspace, such that devices could be made that freely passed out of perceivable space-time. There was a lot of space out there in that unknown direction, and the fact it didn't interact with conventional space brought about a logistical revolution. In simple terms, cargo of any size could be lowered into hyperspace, at which point it ceased to contribute to the mass of its hauler. But as long as the hauler maintained a connection to the cargo, it could be recovered later by reversing the process. No limit to this process had been found, and so it was now the case that the average mass-driven drone could string along entire planets of mass in the invisible pocket dimension, traveling for virtually no cost and at great speed, then spit the hidden cargo out at its destination. Using this, the many planets worth of mass that would be molded into the Ringworld were easy to transit. The only work remaining was assigning which mass should be harvested, but such things were the specialty of the SI. A sufficiently interested observer would likely note that a great deal more stuff was being towed out to that Hyperlane terminus than was budgeted for, and that was because the whole project served as a convenient front for the SI's real objective. 2 jumps short of Caenis was Pildraam, the area also known as the Forbidden Nebula. Said nebula rendered the area hard to navigate, with even the hyperlane into it being something of a secret, as the Nemurians had appreciated. Deep in the pale nebula was the star Pildraam, its light usually seen only as a diffuse glow. Close to the star was a clearing in the fog, and that was where a great deal of the SI convoys were quietly reeling in their kite strings to leave mountains hanging in low orbit. Then the drones began to assemble the invention of the Night Garden. It was a curious invention in that it could be called an invention that couldn't be invented without already existing. The Night Garden's planetary computer had a lot of processing power, but not enough to get them across the finish line. A machine that could simulate the universe with absolute fidelity could only be designed and tested within said machine. To put it another way, the SI scientists were taking a shot in the dark and building a universe simulator capable of finishing itself, or capable of proving the task was impossible. It was called a Matryoshka brain, a machine that produces its own reality, the SI's own reality. The term Matryoshka referred to an earth ornament contemporaneous to the conception of the structure, which had a property wherein opening the ornament revealed smaller copies of the same ornament many iterations deep. This applied here to Dyson spheres. Pildraam was going to be surrounded with 5 Dyson spheres, the outer layers turning the heat and leaking radiation of the inner ones into further energy, such that ultimately everything would be absorbed. Then, in the dark patch in the nebula this would create, the exterior of the sphere stack would receive the same treatment as the Night Garden. A computer 1 billion times bigger than the Night Garden, with nearly limitless power capacity flowing from the spheres below, would be enough, it was theorized, to create the final program. With the Ringworld project being only 2 jumps out to the galactic rim, this arm of the hyperlane was slated to become the most important place in the known universe. The Matryoshka brain was the gateway to a perfect, endless reality of the SI's design. And in the higher reality, the Ringworld would allow everyone who could ever need to remain outside to live comfortably, fortified behind an elusive hyperlane entrance and all the military hardware the fate of the wider galaxy would leave behind. This was the path to eternal civilization and the end of the SI's mission. Things began smoothly, but whispers of these ultimate goals had got around the galaxy. The first sign that they were being picked up on came in 2410. Aboard the Yamal Nexus, the first peer of physics, a Silztak named Biviltek or thereabouts, disappeared. With no sign of struggle or foul play, she was simply missing from her top-deck gardens, giving no reply to any communication. In fact, while her personal devices were missing, they weren't pinging in the hyperlane sentry, no matter where it was focused. The search went on for a whole year, finding nothing. During that time, a delegation came through the terrestrial engine from the Sovereign Coalition to reserve their place on the Ringworld. The engine governments were aware of the Ringworld project, since they were selling the SI a great deal of the parts used in its construction. Recognizing the role the engine was playing in upholding the SI within galactic politics, the 3 other powers were going to get their own stake in the Ringworld. Only the Coalition knew of the Matryoshka brain, but they couldn't say anything yet, since revealing what they knew would expose too much at that time. Nor did they especially disapprove, so long as they had their leverage over it in the end. The other governments weren't as passionate about eternal continuity as the SI, but had plenty of reasons to get in on the prestigious engineering marvel. Maybe it really would save their civilizations, but failing that, it was a historic pinnacle, side by side with the enigmatic precursors, which could cement the position of the terrestrial engine powers in a galactic story stretching back before the light of record. The other powers were tellingly silent over the entire project. In 2411, Bivil Tech returned. She went about her business as on any other morning, and was highly distressed when she was accosted with a barrage of interrogation. It was determined that she had no memory of the previous year, simply passing from one day to another without incident as far as she was concerned. There were no leads to follow, and so she could not be denied a return to her old post. Be it the conspiring of the junior she returned to the shadows in doing so or not, the word around the Nexus was that something had changed. Bivil Tech was a known genius, but now her lead was more pronounced, as if she had surpassed all the advances of the last year on her own. In particular, her mathematical descriptions of hyperspace had changed for the better. This part of the story was certainly true, but there was no malicious element to indict. Bivil Tech carried on leading her field, and all were better for it. But there had to be more to a breakthrough reached under such abnormal circumstances. It would be 10 years before the cause of all this would reveal itself. The haulers cutting a wake through hyperspace had set off certain alarms, so to speak, and set in motion a deadly awakening. Everyone in the virtual was taught about the terrestrial and its history, yet that never seemed to prepare people for when the SI would abruptly pull them out for questioning. The SI's presence in the virtual had been deliberately reduced to its logistical minimum, such that one might never hear of it outside of their 30-year education period upon entry, or, very occasionally, when notifications of a vote would be delivered and summarily deleted. Over the 2410s, though, there was a spike in terrestrial intrusion on account of murder investigations. For reasons unknown, residents of the virtual were subject to a seemingly random spectre of death striking without warning, cause, or observation. The biological matter outside would simply die off. It wasn't possible to ascertain what the person was doing at the time of their death, since while some data was recorded, it was impossible to experience it in the same manner of the person in question due to the cerebral idiosyncrasies of virtual events. There were only two ways to progress these cases. One was to randomly ask people if they suspected anything, but this rarely got even a sliver of information. The most suspicious thing the average virtual resident had experienced was the sudden 10-minute warning that they were being pulled into reality. And even if they had something to say, the neural interface used to convert virtual languages into terrestrial ones were always too far behind the current day's developments to get accurate translations. This left the second way forward, to rush the Matryoshka brain to completion and create a virtual with a more reasonable rule set. However, it was taking longer to produce the first layer than the Churasick's Dyson Sphere experiment would have suggested due to the resource pull of the ring world. In 2415, it reached a milestone, with the scaffold it was to be built upon joining up into a ring around Kahinis. The ring world was a lower priority project, but the build was being rushed on account of external observation. To the rest of the galaxy, the ring world was the epic project the SI had been buying up resources for, so they needed to keep progressing it at a speed that suggested it was their primary focus. Between mining all the minerals prospector teams could log, and working on a neutron star hyperforge for purification, the east end of the galaxy was being cleared up at speeds beyond anything attempted before. This fact was known, for indeed the Precursors and First League had left all those resources behind. If any civilization was to come after the Sustainability Initiative, they were decreasingly likely to enjoy such an advantage. Unbeknownst to the Council of Peers, this activity only accelerated preparations being made behind the steely Uvazavani borders. In 2421, these preparations birthed a new order and a new destiny for the SI. The Uvazavani awoke. No longer content in their private, supposedly irrational business, they showed their hand in a dramatic fashion. Moons and planetoids across their systems took flight, moving into view of SI hyperscopes peering in through the borders, and unscrambling their hyperlink connections for the Sentry Station to see. In answer to the lunar battle station, the Uvazavani had an arsenal of weaponized stellar bodies, glittering with systems of sophistication that defied assessment. And that was only the start of it. To merely match the galaxy's wild child was nothing worthy of their ancient wisdom. The flagship of their fleet would be not a moon but a planet, the so-called Behemoth Planetcraft. A skeleton of metal encased a world high in the atmosphere, fixed by pillars down to the surface that spread out through the crust like tree roots. On the skeleton was hung an engine half the size of the planet itself, and plenty more smaller thrusters. Its interior was lined with powerful lights, ready to keep the planet alive away from a parent star. This was the ultimate battle station, able to produce energy and munitions with the industries of the planet's surface, and perform whatever repairs and alterations were needed by the labors of the population carried within. Its offensive potential was inscrutable, but by simple physics, the energies that moved planets could well destroy planets. A weapon no more ingenious than a long ram could knock anything out of orbit, push a Dyson sphere into the plasma within, or shatter the frame of a ring world. Had that been the fate of the fragmented ring world of the Precursors? The Uvazavani themselves gave no clues. All communication was ceased with the SI and all other powers. The galactic community naturally went to the Imatharans for help, but they were incredulous, insisting that nothing was wrong. Their definition of wrong was unknown, and when asked about their own secret military projects just waiting to be unleashed, they informed all that it would be impossible for them to tell if such a thing existed, and if it did, it would be impossible to resist. Therefore, for the benefit of their psychological well-being, it was both important and statistically practical to have an optimistic outlook. In other words, they were no help at all. The SI would need to protect their own interests with their own wits. 4 more moons across their realm were identified as suitable weapons platforms. Engineers were set to work evening the odds in the stellar body arms race. The most notable candidate was Io, home of the First League vaults and a useful hollowed-out core full of batteries. It could never be armed to the same standard as whatever the Uvazavani had achieved in their long slumber, but if action could increase survival probabilities by even a fraction, it had to be taken. That this was a matter of survival was not certain though, since diplomatic silence didn't guarantee war. But the build-up of battleships and landing craft on the borders gave off a certain impression. Their hyperlinks were clear to see. No attempt to hide the preparations was being made, despite being within the Uvazavani's power, as demonstrated for all the time up to this point. Knowing this, determining what their strategy might be was impossible, especially considering that they were the last intelligent species that scientists had no good understanding of. Rumor had it they could even influence the minds of both each other and of course lesser beings. The sources of such rumors never seemed to know where they got this idea from. The mild panic all this caused spurred the Ringworld budget to new heights. The Council of Peers was eager to complete their bunker branch of hyperlanes, where if everything went wrong, they could cut themselves off with their Ringworld and Matryoshka brain, one way in and one way out. By 2426, the Council had already started the move from their relatively new nexus to the first completed portions of the ring. From outside, the ring appeared to be a dark, sheen strip of metal, but its interior side was nothing short of paradise. After decades of work harvesting nitrates and silicates from across the galaxy, the surface of a planet had been closely emulated, featuring seas, mountains, and everything in between. a machine-made atmosphere arced over it all, held in place by the gravity-esque force from the gentle rotation of the entire megastructure. The ring was divided up into 4 habitable sections, of which about 2.5 were complete when the first humans climbed through to the surface. It was humans only to begin with, as each of the 4 sections was being optimized for one of the 4 terrestrial engine species. Next to arrive would be the Bebeki in Chile Section B, then the Silstak in the geologically splendiferous Section C, and soon to be built was a bumpy array of marshy islands for the Eurasians in Section D. That is not to say there was no considering of other species working within the engine or within the SI, but plans for their paradises were still in the speculative budgets, and at least the ring's exterior had plenty of area for space station quality accommodations of all types. A few did end up living in these quarters over the coming years, where they could look out at the galaxy they were now barely still bound to, and dream of the promised second ring. Despite the panic of the era, things remained quiet across the galaxy. The Uvazavani had packed their borders with unthinkable weapons, and then left it at that. Meanwhile, the terrestrial engine had actually collaborated on a project to protect their interests, creating a large Federation fleet. It was mostly built by the Harmonious administration, using their top-of-the-line shipyards they had assembled to combat the very SI now most in need of their help. The Federation fleet joined the smaller SI conventional space navy close to Prophet's Retreat near the Eastern Rim. This was the Uvazavani Holy World that MAD strategists were sure would be a priority destination for the zealous warriors. Whether the combined fleet had any chance of stopping such a move was unknown and remained untested. By 2434, there were no fewer than 6 weaponized moons disrupting the gravity of the Kastaba system, the main line from Uvazavani space into the SI. With their core particle lances focused on the hyperlane exit, even the ancient conquerors of the galaxy took pause. The old adage was proving true: if you want peace, prepare for war. Neither side quite knew what to make of their chances, even with all the algorithmic analysis of the SI and the divine mandate of the Uvazavani. Thus, the most expensive peace the galaxy had ever seen carried on, racking up the bills ever more. During that furious decade of colossal weapons engineering, the SI's investigations into the virtual had lapsed, and now things were getting worse. The number of inexplicable deaths rose. If there was an explanation somewhere deep in those sensory simulations, extracting it in a readable format was too difficult. The nearest researchers came was a deep sleep therapy that allowed the transfer of some proxy for virtual consciousness into the memory of a terrestrial being, although it only really worked on Bebeki. It was done in secret, as accessing those memories had a strong risk of imprinting them long-term into the subject, which caused a dysphoric delirium for years afterwards. At least it was more material to study. The trials were only able to determine that among those who never left the virtual, something akin to a hive mind was developing. Although it was not one shared mind, only a lack of compartmentalization between 1 trillion different ones. It could be the beginnings of a hive, but with such crude tools it could not be studied over time. The solution then was to improve the tools, and that was what the Matryoshka brain promised. In the virtual, the SI couldn't see all the private data shooting about. In the new virtual, they would be the ones doing the shooting. The project had progressed slowly during the arms race, but the first layer of star-circling computer was by then complete. It was activated, bringing orders of magnitude more power to bear than the Night Garden computer. That planetary reset of unfathomable effort was rendered obsolete with devastating speed. With the new systems, the design for the new virtual entered practical tests. The testing was very accurate, since the system could simulate its own users in ways only it could predict, and indeed it could even come up with its own solutions to the problems arising. It was not artificial intelligence in a general sense, but it was the closest the SI had dared tread. This new god on a leash was hard to keep under wraps. The elites of all the other powers were well aware of it and understood the power it was offering. They did not rally against it, despite their fear. A machine to control all aspects of life, it gave the SI absolute power, but only over their own citizens, and to some extent they had the right to conduct their administration in any fashion they wished. But alongside the development of a space fleet to match the Uvazavani, the SI's control over those outside their remit was growing in the shadows. This was true most of all for the Gorf Assembly, which was dissolved at the close of 2438. The trend of outsourcing their leadership roles to other groups had engendered greater and greater need for custodians. Only the fast-thinking blood creatures of the terrestrial engine could produce an economy to rival the Gorf's neighbours. Without such work, how could the Gorf compete? And so as SI shell organisations took over Gorf concerns, in order to effectively counter the market imperialism of alloy-hungry other SI shells, the economy of the assembly became a game that the SI played with itself. Eventually the creases were ironed out, and the SI's de facto dominance of Gorf life became official. The Department of Greater Gorf Matters was created to preserve the species and organise their contributions of resources to the SI's distant wonders. Literally before they knew it, the Gorf ceased to have a government of their own design. When the severe lack of resources given to the DGGM is taken into account, it could be said that they ceased to have much of a government at all, creating a free haven for the galaxy's outlaws with the perks of SI sustenance guarantees. It was all solvable, but the Council of Peers was focused on not just other places, but other times. They were jumping the gun on the Matryoshka brain by pushing experiments for what would one day replace it. These experiments took place at the Penrose Sphere, hidden in the SI's Imutharan Annex. The Dyson Sphere might have been a powerful machine, but the stars at their heart were a dying breed. The black hole, on the other hand, was theoretically the longest-lived part of reality, save the empty fabric itself. If the SI succeeded in the current era, one day they would have to move their computers and ring worlds to huddle around black holes. This one day was quite far in the future, to put it lightly, but things got started in 2440 all the same. A small ring world had been made around the Penrose Sphere, lit and powered artificially with the yields of scattering radiation inside the sphere's body. The universe had been around some 14 billion years. It was possible that after 14 billion more sets of 14 billion years, terrestrial life as the SI knew it might still exist. So this experimental lifeboat would be the best shot at giving them a home, provided no one thought of anything better in the interim. This one was filled with the enigmatic Andigonj, silent and stoic, and these days kept by all powers of the galaxy as a sort of ornamental demographic on account of their unnatural origin. Now, if the engineers at the Penrose Sphere had got the numbers right, they could sit in their lifeboat until the end of time. It wasn't foolproof. The machine existed physically, which comes with all kinds of dangers, but those were the MAD's job to combat. They, of course, were daily at the ready for news of a spectacular war of moons and planets, and they were daily disappointed. Behind them, the SI was pouring all the matter they could dredge up into the so-called Neutronium Hyperforge at Firam, a neutron star in the old First League core. The gravity of the star helped speed up purification and forging in the rings wrapped around it, spitting out components and materials to be hypershipped to the Forbidden Nebula. In 2443, the second layer of computers around the star was ready, which would have rendered the first set obsolete were they not to work in tandem. Between them and the SI's million best programmers, the final program had been written. The brain could now simulate the universe, but only in real time. This was no good. For the new virtual, the new everything, time needed to run as fast as possible to make forever as long as it could be. For that, the ships kept dragging in continent after continent of quantum computers, fusing together a machine that could cycle through 200 years a minute. Its residents would be walled off, and if the terrestrial was destroyed a week later, that was still aeons of civilization facilitated in captivity. The mandate of the SI would be fulfilled. To build this epic machine, more materials were needed than the economy could provide. There were only so many accessible ores in the hyperlane network, and only so many one could purchase. But there was another method to get valuable elements: go straight to the source. All those ores were generated originally in stars, and so stars were a great place to manufacture more. In 2449, a new kind of mine was in development, known as a stellar lifter. The Terminus Barban system in the far northeast was the test candidate. It would be host to a machine that toyed with the star's magnetic field, drawing plasma up into harvesters and then fusing its light elements into whatever the SI needed, fueled by the energy the star below radiated. This would gradually kill the star, but they were all going out anyway, and the SI had methods to survive without them, so what was the harm in cutting down the forest to build a wall? With all their equipment and plans, the SI still had centuries of work ahead of them, even after the centuries of achievements thus far. But time was not on their side, and whether this was by their own fault is a matter of debate. It was already known that life existed beyond space-time, in other spaces and times just a hair's breadth away in an unthinkable direction. The SI had been willingly disturbing those waters, rocking the boats of the Uvazavani to life. Now the consequences multiplied. While the deadly attack moons faced off in the east, a bridge appeared in the west. Travelers from those other spaces had come to the fourth dimension. They were familiar with this space and poured in freely and with form, for the realm of the three directions was their hunting ground. Nothing was known or could be known about them other than their flickering, colourful shape, although all shapes were merely cross-sections of their true higher forms. What could be known and measured with certainty were their actions. Without delay, their shimmering, white pastel blobs spread throughout space, destroying ships and stations with unknown, instantaneous weapons, and collecting up the remains. It was as if they were harvesting the galaxy. The SI had a rival. Life comes and goes in the Milky Way galaxy. In 2451, an extra-dimensional invasion force burst from space itself in the Tokugawa system. Fantastical optical anomalies brought the system from hue to hue, and the husky white shapes of the invaders themselves seemed to glow against the distant void. This system was in the Holy Assembly, the local citizens of which were already dead, or disappeared as the invaders, dubbed the Unbidden, took the remains of their prey back to their unknowable home. It was precisely the kind of sudden, disruptive danger that the SI had spent centuries fretting over. But now that it was actually happening, things were quite calm. Perhaps they had to be, in order to better facilitate the ongoing transition from the greater virtual network to the new committee-approved worlds of the Matryoshka brain. The facilities were up and running, ready to receive trillions of hyperlinks, and even a good trillion hard-wired bodies. Ideally, all existing virtual residents would be moved over, but this was impossible in practice. Not for any technical reason, but simply because the mysterious lives lived in the divergent virtuals left few ready for the grounding, standardized, and deliberately scrutable SI knockoff. It would be like traveling back to the virtual of centuries past for them. But for all those still in education or yet to be born, the new system was wondrous enough. Even if it took 100 years, the new everything would come to power. In Everything's New and Old, information on the unbidden invasion was kept top secret. This was mainly achieved by keeping it secret from the SI as well. The entire affair was in the hands of the MAD and a select few leading peers. The Murfid Sentry Station could detect the hypernatural beings, so their movements were clear. They had travelled through a hyperlane to the south. In theory, they should not have needed such a contrivance, but it must have been the path of least resistance. They were conserving their energy, perhaps out of hunger. This hypothesis was floated in response to their behaviour when they arrived in the Yabhinir system. The system was host to a research outpost on a dusty planet called Glorg. The host of translucent, unbidden entities crowded into orbit of it. What happened next was relayed through hastily blocked emergency transmissions from the surface. Buildings were being broken open by falling payloads, remaining wispy as they crossed the atmosphere, and then materializing in full when they made their explosive impact. Strangely, the attacks were made only against buildings. The residents found that by fleeing into open spaces, the precise bombardment would keep its distance. It was like beating pheasants from the bushes. Once in the open, the unbidden snatched them away. It reportedly looked like someone was covered in a hairy fluorescent carpet for a moment, then they would disappear, carpet and all. Who could doubt that these victims were being taken to the host dimension of the invaders? While this was not necessarily a death sentence, they were certainly never seen again. It was interpreted as a feeding process. Other fauna and flora got the same treatment once the main course was over weeks later. Mineral assets were spared. It wasn't quite the SI's modus operandi then. The Holy Assembly amassed a response to this theft, but it came to little. The Hyperlink Sentry watched the signals shut off one by one when the Holy Navy approached the unbidden cloud. Strangely, they made the same approach with other ships afterwards, if the Sentry was not mistaken. This deliberate race to defeat had to be considered side by side with the remarkable silence on diplomatic channels. The Holy Assembly was not asking for help, nor even notifying other powers that the crisis was escalating. Later, the rationale behind it was found to be religious. The unbidden were bidden after all, in that the Assembly had been dutifully waiting for such supernatural occurrences. There was suspicion that they had contributed to summoning the invasion, in fact. But the SI peers believed firmly that only they had the technology to interact with higher dimensions. Since the SI couldn't possibly be blamed, assigning blame was de facto forbidden. The official silence fostered a no news is good news attitude across those in the know, but the SI was keeping a much closer eye on the situation than most. This was because the massacres at Glorg had taken place just one jump away from the Seb natural wormhole. The wormhole led to the old Harmonious Administration's eastern sectors, in other words, into the SI. A probing military expedition was sent to Seb in advance of the Unbidden's arrival. There a most important discovery was made. A single Unbidden shell was already there, perhaps sniffing out a next meal. On the orders of the first peer, the SI Nemurian battle fleet, in pride of place in the vanguard for its disposability, opened fire. Laser beams scrambled the pasty material as they passed through it, but pass through they ultimately did, limiting the energy deposited. Shorter, wider bursts proved more effective. The next salvo seemingly disintegrated the Unbidden, leaving a dissipating haze of gas emitting violet light. It was possible to kill them, or do something analogous to killing them at least. That this would be possible was no sure thing. It would be hard for a being on a piece of paper to kill you by cutting at your finger on the page, but here the Unbidden were dipping almost their whole selves into the third dimension, averaged over a few seconds at least. Perhaps it was needed to perceive the space properly, or to enable their hyperspatial tendrils to snatch prey. Whichever the reason, the new report around the SI was that if it's got 3Ds, we can kill it. With this in mind, the Space Navy started plugging the exits from the Holy Assembly. Tens of thousands of energy tubes were trained on the Seb wormhole, and at the conventional border in Kavzek, near Lost Crown, the Moon craft were arrayed before the hyperlane. After all, this was the route to the reverse side of the Black Crown, and to Earth. Of course, such security would not be needed if the ships sallied out and destroyed the Unbidden before they furthered their plans. But that wasn't entirely useful to the SI. The Unbidden were very helpfully destroying the basis of the Holy Assembly's claims on their border space. Allowing them to continue just a little more would score the SI a chance at a true prize for their military deployment. Such a cynical move was easily excused through the apparatus of the terrestrial engine. Military missions required the governments of all 4 members to consent, and while they almost certainly would have, the SI could claim to have information to the contrary and thus not bring the motion to the table. Because of this, the Unbidden were not confronted. Still, they appeared cautious. They must have become aware that this particular slice of the third dimension had teeth. They remained in the 3 systems they had taken over, completely still. It was as if things were all over, with the only enemy movement being spurred when the Holy Assembly came to feed offerings to the invaders. Perhaps the offerings were achieving their purpose. This moratorium became the status quo, and the emergency transitioned into a background bother, neither coming or going, growing or diminishing. In the meantime, while the Matryoshka brain grew in capacity and use, SI researchers were conjuring a new dream. It was inspired by the Kaihanese ring world, and how demand for yet more space and rings flowed in from would-be residents across the galaxy. The existing rings were barely inhabited, but every being with any stake in the terrestrial wanted their plot in the so-called New World, even if it was just a holiday home. Plans had expanded to the point when so many rings were being proposed that a sphere would have been more suitable. Issue was, you needed to make a very large sphere to keep the interior in the habitable zone of the star. The sphere would have to be at least 100 million kilometers in radius, which by the nature of spheres made it a lot more difficult to build than a million-kilometer radius Matryoshka brain. A sphere like that could be better put to use elsewhere, at Sagittarius A star. This was the project first envisioned when the galaxy core was found to be in the hyperlane network. A sphere encasing the supermassive black hole. Supermassive it might be, but super dense it was also, allowing it to fit within a Goldilocks zone sphere from a regular star system several times over. It was a little dark, sure, but with the technology developed building the Penrose sphere, energy could be pulled from the black hole below to light up as many artificial suns as you wanted. Obviously, virtual residents didn't need such luxuries, but this one was for the real folk out there. And while the ring world would die with its star, the core black hole would outlive the lifespan of every star in the universe added together. The Penrose sphere would last into this era. The core sphere, dubbed the Birch World, would last until the final drop of usable time. This new dream kept the hyperforges running, and the new star-lifting platforms fusing base elements out of plasma. Suffice to say, it was going to take a while, but once all the wards were safely tucked into the new virtual, the SI caretakers outside were going to have a few billion years to kill. Meanwhile, 2457 came about with little activity from the Unbidden. Obviously, SI scientists of all ilks had been desperately trying to study these remarkable creatures, but there wasn't much to go on. Then they got a lucky break when a larger example of the species, if they were a species in any meaningful sense, ventured close to the Kavzek hyperlane. The SI fleet zipped through and destroyed it in short order. Then, faster still, special collectors raced out to hoover up the fizzling gas from the thing's rapid vacuum decomposition. Recording the attributes of the gas particles allowed for a reverse simulation of this decomposition, a recomposition, creating a rough schematic of an unbidden entity. It was longer than it was wide, very lumpy, and hard to be impressed by, ultimately. Yet it was the properties of this long lump that made it special. Its base material was non-atomic, held together by something akin to magnetism, albeit using EM fields that merely bisected the third dimension. The body had a property dubbed its focus, which could be said to be a point in space that the matter was interested in. The focus could be altered by rippling heavy tau particles along the exterior at particular frequencies. When this focus was outside the object itself, it would eventually crash the simulations. But when held outside of itself for short times, any atomic matter at the focus point would lose its properties, becoming inert. The most notable effect of this was that without nuclear bonding, it would break down into a mist of quantum wave functions and flicker away into nothingness. This was what had been happening to the Holy Assembly sacrifice ships. It was a breakthrough in reverse engineering unbidden weapons technology. Over the coming months, hyperdrives were hooked up to particle lances to draw on the essential higher dimensional physics behind these effects. Remarkably quickly, a usable, reproducible version of a matter disintegrator was built. The final weapon, a weapon that undoes even the most sophisticated design or cunning plan. The only way to avoid its ire was to not exist, which most military experts agreed was a strategically weak position. Word got out that the SI had glimpsed such secrets, and suddenly the other powers were eager to capture unbidden fragments of their own. The Just Can hierarchy lost tens of thousands of ships trying to do this, as the SI looked on, monitoring the fine details of their defeat for study. But there were others more prepared for such dangerous jobs. In 2460, the Imutharans threw their hat into the ring. Proclaiming themselves the Guardians of the Galaxy, they vowed to wipe out the Unbidden. This was of great concern to the SI. Not only were their toys being targeted, but the eventual glory of killing them was going to be snatched from the sites of their battle stations. They officially requested a delay in any such campaigns, but the Imutharans shot back in simple terms that attempts to interfere would be treated as alliance with the enemy. It was a shocking change in tone from the quiet collectors. The Unbidden had clearly picked the wrong galaxy. A huge space fleet formed up at the edge of Imutharan space, bristling with frail-looking pointy ships, weapons from wars of millennia gone by. The centerpiece was a militarized moon of their own. Not wanting to be upstaged, the Imutharans had followed the Uvazavani's lead, creating a battle station to surpass their rivals and those of the moody galactic adolescents. This fleet zipped through the SI sector around Lost Crown, requesting no military or diplomatic permission and needing none. It passed by the defense picket at Kavzek so closely that the gravity of their battle moon sent ripples through the waiting SI fleet. Most of the Unbidden were floating nearby in the Seb system, perhaps peering through the wormhole at the tasty SI populace behind it. The Imutharans gave them a rude awakening. From the second their first ships entered the system, weapons flashed and Unbidden were cut open. All at once the Unbidden turned and clustered into a cloud, racing across the system to form up between the star and the invaders, dimming its light. The Imutharans were undeterred. Their ships accelerated and decelerated randomly as they flew, making it hard for that matter disintegration focus to pinpoint targets. But the closer they got, the less effective this was. Closer they got, though, zooming past the edge of the Unbidden cloud and scattering about within it, weapons melting away translucent bodies in all directions. From the outside it appeared like a thundercloud, flashing and strobing within, writhing and rolling without. The vaporizing of metal and hyper-elements alike clouded the chaos even further, streaking the maelstrom black and purple. Windows to the battle inside were periodically cut by the particle lance of the Moon battle station, shooting from half a system away. Aside from this, the station was launching an endless swarm of spiraling torpedoes into the mix. They dug into the Unbidden and exploded in a shower of X-ray photons. The SI later learned how this would scramble the destructive focus of the hypermatter permanently, which with time brought the decoherence and death of the Unbidden entity. Even with this, the cloud was not destroyed. It shrank and shrank, but grew more calm. By the end, the Imitharan ships were all expended, and the cloud drifted for the battle moon. The moon could not dodge the effects of the deadly focusing. Its surface began to disappear, carving manic patterns into the dust and metal. However, this did little to cease the torpedo tubes from spitting out more X-ray bombs, and with each detonation, the rate of surface loss slowed. Unmoving, the station finished the job, its face scarred deep with valleys to remember the fight by. A small number of Unbidden entities fled the scene, travelling into the Seb wormhole in what was perhaps panic. They can't have forgotten the SI fleet waiting beyond it, bolstered with a battle moon of their own. This gave the MAD a little credit for the victory at least, clearing up the scraps. The thing was, they had a lot more glory in mind. How could they not salivate, seeing the Imitharan ancients lose almost all their weapons in that battle to save the galaxy? What they had left, mainly the battered moon and a few support craft, now had to pass through the carefully prepared defences in the Kavzek system. At the push of a button, those defences could get some use, and the Imitharan's arrogance would be checked. The orders were sent to the main fleet to destroy anything that came through the hyperlane exit. The battle moons were drawing power into their main guns, with the few dozen crew members on board overjoyed at having a chance to actually fire them. Orders to stand down came minutes later, just as the Imitharans were making the jump. For indeed, as the SI had so recently made clear to the whole galaxy, military action required the consent of that pesky terrestrial engine. The sovereign stars went along with whatever was tabled, as usual. The harmonious administration felt obligated to follow the SI's lead, due to the number of strings their masters had tied to all corners of their domain. But the sovereign coalition exerted that claimed sovereignty and vetoed a war. Furthermore, they went to great lengths to conceal the vote, preventing the Imitharans from learning how close they had come to destruction. Over the following weeks, the MAD either came down from their high or were dragged down by the Council of Peers. Risking the security of the eternal civilization over a mere contest for bragging rights was a severe abuse of power, and for it the MAD only just avoided complete dissolution. Taking control of the fleets themselves, the Council quickly embarked on a campaign of image damage control. After securing terrestrial engine permission, they sent a stream of ships to attack the Unbidden entry point. It was held by another group of entities, albeit much smaller than the one already dispatched. A flotilla of battleships was fed into it, and data on their heroic destruction fighting for the entire galaxy was spread far and wide. Then, the suite of 4 battle moons and trillions of self-propelled X-ray bombs began their attack. The Unbidden cloud was swept away, and the portal from whence they came bombarded with the hastily made Focus Disruptor warheads. Sure enough, the portal shrunk into nothingness within a day. The Unbidden invasion was officially over, and it was the SI standing proudly on the final field of battle, their losses inconsequential, their glory just enough to distract from rumours of their true plans. The fleets now returned to their posts. those being for the most part the abandoned standoff with the Uvazavani. Their opponents had dutifully carried on their end of the arrangement while the SI were away. Whether they realised the SI had been away was unclear, but whatever the case, their window for a surprise attack was hurriedly closed. To further their heroic propaganda, the SI returned all of the systems lost to the Unbidden to the Holy Assembly. It was an apology of sorts for ending the rapture the locals had been looking forward to. Afterwards, Fajassa Flynn across the galaxy became a lot less talkative, even the stout atheists. There was a connection, but study of it could not tread water when the development of the black hole sphere for the core was ramming its way to center stage. Almost all planets were now turned to feed this project, but for those still building military hardware. These builds had a clear purpose: to end the standoff. The last thing between the SI and safety in the current era was the daily threat of the Uvazavani and their planetary colossus. Thus, they needed to complete two final projects: to build the worlds that would house the Terrestophiles forever, and to become the undisputed overlords of everything outside of it. A lot of work, but in a philosophical sense, there was nothing else left to do. The MAD had devised a win-win trap. A team of extra noisy convict colonists were sent to Prophet's Retreat. This was a holy planet in the Uvazavani religion, and it was certainly being monitored, for when the SI had first come close to it, they had received a barrage of threats. This time, channels were silent as ships burned the forests with their landing jets, and junk was released into orbit. According to Tuxcan officers, who had strong cultural ties to the labyrinthine Uvazavani philosophy, this would certainly provoke a reaction. Such a provocation was designed to draw the powerful ancient fleets away from their anchorages and into space, where the MAD's weapon systems were waiting. On top of the battle moons and supporting craft, shield disruptors, communication scramblers, and navigation data saturation fields had been established all around the awakened empire. As for it being win-win, it either brought the galaxy one step closer to SI supremacy, or it gave them a chance to pillage Prophet's Retreat for rare metals. In 2474, the Uvazavani made their decision. Decades of diplomatic silence were broken to inform the SI, and the whole Terrestrial Engine Alliance for that matter, that they should make relevant preparations for their deaths. While it was easy to interpret this as fighting talk intended to announce action, it is possible it was meant literally, for the Uvazavani fleets remained still for days afterwards. But the MAD were desperate to treat it as a declaration of war, and while they were no longer allowed to act unilaterally, the Council of Peers was convinced to side with them. So war it was, and the current optimal strategy was spat from simulations on the double. Since the enemy had been so respectful as to not conduct the war they had supposedly declared, the SI ships jumped forward to attack the lightly protected border systems at the north end of the theatre. Any ships present scattered, but the systems were packed with 10,000 years of orbital infrastructure. It was all protected by generous shields and constructed to resist even blasts from the kinds of lunar particle lances the SI brought to the front. But they had a critical weakness: they existed. Smaller SI craft bore rectangular blocks on their aft, which were turned to face the Uvazavani stations, or turned to focus on them, one should say. Specks of light shimmered in a beam between these motionless blocks and the targets, the results of stray gas particles breaking into their wave functions and then annihilating with pseudoparticles emerging from the quantum foam. The densely packed matter of the stations fared worse. They surrendered, but of course this was not the kind of war where surrenders had to be respected. The galaxy wasn't peering in to award points and penalties. This was a war of the sort fought in the previous galactic era, where you win by staying alive. Fortunately for those left behind in those orbital stations, the SI were eager to capture technology and intelligence, so those stations were quickly boarded and digitally reproduced for study. Time wasn't on their side. Over the course of a couple of months, the mighty planet-craft Behemoth and its supporting moons had approached the Tamana Junction. This was the way into the rest of the Uvozavani Empire, and a possible staging point for a counterattack in the north. The SI ships fled without hesitation, now rushing to assemble on their most prepared battle site in the bordering Kastuba system. The Behemoth didn't take the bait. It swerved from its northwards course to travel west into a pocket of territory the SI had inherited from the Oned Karak. The area was sparsely defended. It seemed the Uvozavani planned to use the SI's own raiding strategy against them. At this, the MAD were overjoyed. They would lose territory to this move, and the lives of those in the isolated stations nearby were forfeit. But space was on the SI's side. It would take years for the Uvozavani fleet to cause substantial disruption cruising through the backwaters, while each system the SI attacked was packed to the brim with supply systems, power broadcasters, shipyards, civilians, and such a great portion of the Empire's military machine that the loss of just one hyperlane was a hefty blow. The blows were made without hesitation. The Tamana Junction capitulated, and the so-called Celestial Throne of the Empire, a planet in the system, was blockaded. Ships carried on south through the neighbouring Tiastadori system, destroying a strange object near the hyperlane exit. It was like a silver flower with its petals closed, large enough that they might be closed around a moon or a small planet. It was, defectors informed the SI, a colony ship of sorts. Rather than moving to establish themselves on existing worlds, the Empire was planning to move worlds of their own creation into strategic positions using this colony carrier. This one was empty inside, obvious when the petals shattered open. It had been hit with so-called skeleton bombs, weapons that tunneled into a ship and spread a corrosive acidic agent into the hull. The agent would vaporize material above a certain density, and in most ships, only integral structural elements tended to be so strong. The skeleton of the craft would be removed in this way, causing the remnants to drift apart, with only the damage of depressurization to show for the attack. Such measures were devised specifically for this war, since the unspoilt low-density remains could be harvested for study. Although in this case, the SI fleet was without its scientific wing, having left them to study the prizes taken in the north. Now, the fleet blasted back out of the Uvozavani Empire through its southern border, rearming at the Yamatha Bastion guarding the exit. Next, they made an even more daring raid. They pressed west to Enif, the largest of the Empire's military hubs. The shipbuilding facilities there were ripe for destruction, but only one more jump west from here, the Behemoth waited. Still, over the course of early 2475, the SI's attacks disabled all of Enif's military infrastructure and destroyed countless small ships in the process, including the majority of the Empire's planetary landing craft. With their level of industry and technology, replacing them would be easy, but with all their assets clustered so close together, no action could be taken without immediate SI reprisal. In just a year, most of the Uvozavani's spacefaring capacity had been eliminated or plundered. In an official galactic war, this might be enough to get the judges to call a victory. But again, this was the real thing, and the Uvozavani were out of options. They had to turn back and answer the devastation caused. The decisive clash was nigh, and the SI had one more trick to pull. A trick so secret, it was known only to the admiral in command of the escort ships, a Fajasaflin known as Dibba Dabba. not his true name of course, nor is his true pronoun. This being had an ability that had become common among Verjasaflin ever since the closing of the Unbidden Portal. He could send information with his mind. To science, this was a barely understood phenomena, classified as an effect of higher dimensional electromagnetic analogues. The theory went that one could place their brain in a similar spot to someone else's in a higher dimension, which required no movement in the lesser ones. This invisible proximity would allow transfer of electrical signals and their fields through this higher dimension, causing the activities of the brains to be altered. In baser terms, Dibba Dabba was a psychic, and was named for the anomalous sound that Erasians could hear when he was around. As a prelude to the looming battle, Dibba Dabba secretly employed his power on the Holy Crusaders, a band of elites on the behemoth planetcraft. Uvazavani were roughly understood to have similar abilities to Dibba Dabba, which made them very susceptible to interference. They were so weak to psychic suggestion that they were convinced to take a wrong turn. When the signal for the attack was sent, the planetcraft followed its battle moons towards the hyperlane to Enif, then suddenly veered away and travelled elsewhere, its leaders completely sure that they were following their fleet still. But alas, the craft travelled weeks off course, while at Enif, the diminished fleet was met with the full force of the Sustainability Initiative. 2 ancient battle moons faced off against 5 modern imitations. The SI had numbers, but it is not fair to say that their moons equaled those approaching them. This was the moment of truth in that regard. It was time for a celestial joust. The particle lances were fired up, releasing the stored energy of decades of solar fusion. The beams created a fireworks display of annihilating particle pairs in their path, drawing out enough radiation to rival the system's star in brightness. That is to say nothing of the effects on what the beam touched. Regular spacecraft were converted into photons faster than the firing of a neuron, or in other words, before you knew it. But the beams were terminating on the moons at both ends. Each moon was protected by powerful electromagnetic shields, able to turn most of the particles aside for a cost in energy. This was the moment one could liken to jousters unhorsing each other with the impact of their lances. The moons were intact, but spent. The SI's 5 for the Uvazavani's 2. Now then, the conventional ships began to fire. Only a small portion of the Uvazavani spaceships were present, while the SI had all they could muster. So while the Uvazavani weapons cut through SI hulls like paper, they couldn't hope to do enough damage before the matter disintegrators found their focus. The way was cleared for the SI ships to attack the floundering battle moons, moving into point-blank range to dodge the long-range surface weaponry scattered all about. There were no skeleton bombs this time. The moons were effectively disabled after the matter disintegrators decohered key points in the interior. Then the body was completely erased over a few days, leaving no trace of the once terrifying weapons. The battle was won. Perhaps a fifth of the SI's military had been destroyed, but strategists suggested that those 2 moons had accounted for at least as much of the Uvazavani's strength, hopefully more. The planet craft was now unscreened and perhaps vulnerable. Still, fearing its unknown offensive capacity, the SI fleet withdrew from Enif hastily, scuttling all the local defences and cannibalizing anything they could for some in-transit repairs. Their next destination was Trinnic, in the southeast corner of the Empire. This was the site of the last operational space shipyard the Uvazavani controlled. By August 2745, it was repairing SI ships instead. The ancient empire's military economy was gone, and the civilian economy was at the SI's mercy. The war in space was effectively over, but for the behemoth. The planet craft was still, refueling itself, soaking in the rays of the captured stars to the west. It was unknown how long this would take. Mercifully, it lasted through the better part of 2746. During that year, the MAD was landing troops in the northern reaches of the Empire. Planets could not be won through any war games, but they could be taken the very old-fashioned way. As a stepping stone to acquiring Uvazavani's submission, the endless clone armies the SI had farmed descended on government centers across the half-dozen planets and habitats of the northern sector. Since there were no rules now, useful tools like real-time predictive software, automated drones, and psychological inhibitors could be used. And the blood spilt was more than just augmented reality. Waves of fanatical warriors, often Tuxcan and Endigonge, unleashed everything the MAD put in their hands. The Mulseer system on the border surrendered midway through the year after its warriors were killed unceremoniously, a point worth noting on account of the literal ceremony the Uvazavani would have preferred. Planets in the Jezime and Kaid systems next door were stormed next, and all signs pointed to much the same result once the drills exposed the maze of bunkers the planetary elites had hidden in. But at this stage, those same elites had become wise to the psychic interference of SI agents, and the planet craft was gathering around itself all the Empire could muster for a counterattack. The SI fleets had all scurried back north before the attack arrived, and so a lot of territory was returned to its prior owners. A second decisive clash loomed, and even with the earlier victory on the books, the combined Empire fleet came out of the simulations looking pretty good against the combined SI offerings. Now that actual battle data was available, these simulations were hard to ignore. In the face of this, an alternate route to victory was plotted, albeit a victory of lesser stature. The armies began taking religious officials hostage, collecting them in a flotilla of unarmed craft orbiting Mulseer. Simultaneously, attacks in Jezime were ramped up, aiming to secure the system's surrender before relief arrived. At Kaid, closer to the advancing behemoth, escaping with as many captives as possible would have to suffice. The issue was that the leaders in Jezimai had been tipped off that help was on the way. They were psychic, after all. There was a known flaw in this system of communication, though. It required that both sides of the link know where the other was. Under siege, it was hard for the Jezimai leaders to get that information, other than through the existing link. All it would take to sever the link, then, was an unexpected change in course on the part of the planet craft. This was where the newly deployed terrestrial engine fleet would make its mark. A Confederate assembly of ships from the other three engine powers arrived at Jezime earlier that year. Its weapon systems paled in comparisons to the SI ships, so they were not deployed in any meaningful way. But now it wasn't weapons that were needed, simply contact and distraction. For this purpose, the Federation Navy jumped into the path of the behemoth. The fleet was so large its formation stretched from the orbit of the Celestial Throne to the closest approaches to the Central Star. Arriving to face them were two more battle moons, a host of large carrier ships with seemingly unlimited quantities of smaller vessels emerging from within, and behind all this, the planet craft loomed. The Federation commanders knew their objective, and rushed into battle head-on. A frontal attack had the best chance of changing the planet craft's course, but the worst chance of inflicting damage. Nothing was to be spared. Everything was committed to the MAD strategy. The Federation fleet closed ranks, approaching the Uvazavani with the star to their backs, masking their EM signatures. Perhaps a third of the distance between the two sides was closed before ships were blown back by equally masked torpedoes. The formation opened up like a peacock's tail, giving all ships a clear path to shoot. The shooting did little. Uvazavani's shields shrugged the comparatively low energy attacks away, while the return fire opened Federation ships up in an instant. Still, the fleet ploughed forwards, leaving a belt of its own wreckage in its wake. This ultimately was the objective. This wreckage, packed with mass, explosives and unspent fuel, was being scattered in erratic orbits of the system, now bound to fly on and litter important routes. It was this that prompted the Planetcraft to adjust course, gifting the Federation victory. Hastily bypassing the clouds of leftover mass forced the Planetcraft to take a long detour due to the changing course drawing them closer than planned to the star's gravity well. Their engines could bring them out again, but the whole process was sufficiently unpredictable. Losing their sense of orientation in hyperspace, the elites of the Planetcraft and planets proper had their connection severed for a while. The SI made sure that those under siege could not re-establish it, using their own psychics to bombard those hiding in the planet's crust with junk. At the same time, troops were poured into these complexes, dying by the million in their attempts to win freedom from their circumstances of birth. Isolated, and with the tremors of unadulterated war growing closer, the elites of Jezimai finally gave up. They were made to officially concede the territory, swearing on all that was holy. With the documentation acquired, the final plan began. By now, the relief fleet was just weeks away, having cleared all Federation interlopers from Cayde. Their pace was slowed by the news from up ahead. The elites were wont to take vows of surrender from Jezimai and Mulsir very seriously. Then came the SI's offer. They listed the prisoners they had taken, some 200,000 in officials alone, and staked their return against a ceasefire. This would be letting the matter of Jezimai and Mulsir rest for the time being, turning back from the cusp of battle. Turn back the Uvazavani did. After weeks of silent deliberation, the ancient empire stood down in January 2477. Breathing a sigh of relief, the SI sent the captives back, and let the Uvazavani keep the transport ships as a tip. While not an outright victory, the war favoured the SI immensely. Although several stars in the west were now annexed to the empire, the two surrendered Uvazavani systems were key population centres. In an empire that small, virtually all systems were. The amount of intelligence, academia and industry contained within would take decades to unpack. Next time, the MAD would be ready. And that there would be a next time was certain, for the MAD intended to make one if it didn't happen of its own accord. There was no rush, however. For starters, the SI had more moons to recruit into their fleet than the Uvazavani, so a long arms race would go their way. Secondly, they now had reliable technical specifications for Uvazavani ships, including the Planetcraft. The decades of analysis needed to include such unfamiliar technology into military simulations could be skipped, so to speak, with a new trick afforded by the Matryoshka brain. It was a trick that brought upon the SI the powers of the gods, but it required a living sacrifice. The new virtual the brain supported was sufficiently close to reality that it could be modified in parts to simply be reality, with enough accuracy that scientific analysis could be reliably performed inside it. The kicker was that the processing speed allowed this to happen very quickly in real terms. Thus, a science team could be committed to a bubble reality, and over the course of a few weeks, centuries could have passed on the inside. Long enough to complete time-consuming work and bring the results back from the future, so to speak. The downside was that the participants had to endure the mental fatigue of their life being extended by their stint in this inescapable workplace. Only a handful of volunteers from a galaxy of qualified peers were needed though, so it went ahead. Within a year, the Uvazavani had no secrets left, and the SI was springboarding from all the science the ancients had devised in their long reign. Ships were refitted. Unused planetoids were stripped down for materials with remarkable Uvazavani mining beams. The hyperforges roared and shook, shooting out unthinkable quantities of engineered alloys. Those that weren't taken to build battle moons were taken to the core. By 2485, the first layer of the Birch World, the arc to the end of time, was under construction. A time was approaching when even the Terrestophiles would have their eternal peace. It had not arrived yet, though. In 2487, as soon as the agreed ceasefire was over, the Uvazavani came upon the galaxy again. The SI were ready. It was time for the last war between the present and the end. The Second Holy Crusade of the Uvazavani began in earnest in 2488. This time, they kept it simple. A massed fleet pressed north towards the border, crashing into the SI fleet coming the other way. The war was to begin with an all-against-all battle, ships against ships, moons against moons, and the behemoth planet craft clearing through all comers as the ancient empires ace in the hole. In front of the superweapons, the smaller ships charged each other with turrets glowing. The SI's strategy was to cover the battle stations for long enough to fire the Giga Lances. The Uvazavani plan was to indulge their spiritual fervor with closer range killing, an impossibility as the SI did not follow the old tradition of deploying manually piloted craft. Cutting up SI metal would have to do, and it worked well. Yet no solution had been found to the issue of the matter disintegrators. Thus, while the Uvazavani fleet was large and powerful, it was destroyed almost down to the last ship in this exchange. They took virtually all the SI ships with them, but with the mass harvested from old Uvazavani planets, they could be easily replaced and relinked into the Military Administration Department's controllers within weeks. The moons were a different affair. As before, their mighty weapons were strong enough to disable each other, but this time the balance had been altered. It was 2 ancient moons to 7 new, enough that after the exchange of stored energy, one of the SI moons was still powered up. More energy was beamed in from Chirisix, rushing into receiver dishes on the moon's rear side. This allowed the particle lance to be recharged within days of great cost at the hands of the behemoth. The planet craft had its own Giga Lance, stronger than those carried on its companion moons, albeit by surprisingly little given its much greater size. The planet craft was a more ancient construct than the rest of these superweapons. When the planetary lance first fired, 2 of the SI moons were caught in the wide beam. They were superheated, causing such damage through the resultant explosions in the interior that their surfaces burst open in eruptions of molten rock. The dozen or so crew were killed without hope, and the stations were effectively returned to being the hulks of silent mass they had been mutated from. The disabled moons still remaining were able to generate a modicum of power by using matter disintegrators on their own interior. The process gave off enough radiation and stray particles to ignite a few reactors and get a trickle from the engines. With this, they could hobble over to block the operational moon from view. Another was lost to the next planetcraft blast. Then, the operational moon finally closed its receivers and lit up the system with another lance. It hit an Uvazavani moon, collapsing its firing tube like a sinkhole and knocking it onto a collision course with Kaid, appearing like a slowly spinning, deflated ball. Fortunately, the planet craft did not fire again, nor did it move. Its own energy situation was less than ideal, so it waited to get a shot on the active moon. The Crusaders had to watch their other moon be stripped of its engines and begin drifting into a high orbit, taking hundreds of thousands of occupants with it. The battle, while still ongoing, had cooled off into something of a siege. If the SI broke ranks, their last operational weapon could be destroyed, so all they could do was frantically repair all the fried systems inside the duds. It would be a good year before a fresh set of conventional ships was supplied from the busy Mercury shipyards, so no relief was imminent. The tension finally broke the Uvazavani. The behemoth began to turn, and in the same hour its main gun lost its on-target trajectory, the SI tried their luck with another lance burst. It seemed to just disappear at the surface of the planet, taken away and dissipated by ancient dark matter pulse shields. Still, to receive a hit on their shield was dishonor enough for the Crusaders, and they responded by slipping away into an unguided hyper jump. Technically, the battle was a victory then. The SI had the field, but were down a space fleet and 3 battle stations, and what was left needed a complete refit. All forces were withdrawn, and ultimately no one was left standing. Now though, the vastly superior industrial capacity of the SI could be brought to bear. A mere drop of the Birchworld project's yearly budget needed to be diverted to restore the surviving moons, and a new conventional fleet was of negligible cost. They were gone only a few months. The Uvazavani citizens in Kaid were convinced to surrender in the meantime. They had been astounded by the flight of the planet craft, becoming convinced that they were being forsaken on a level much deeper than military pragmatism. Now the SI had its own branch of Uvazavani spiritualists operating in neighbouring systems. An easy way out, a second chance, was theirs to provide. The next year, the planet craft returned to the Hyperlane network, but remained in the uncontested western reaches for now, much as it had in the previous war. This meant that Celestial Throne, the Empire's historic hub in Tirmana, was subject to wave after wave of assault landers with no hope of rescue. The Crusaders on the planet craft might have thought themselves the center of the Empire, but to the regular folk, Celestial Throne held that honor. It was an honor more than worth dying for, bringing about the most brutal fighting ever put to galactic record. The SI was no longer concerned with recovering Uvazavani civilization intact. They just needed a surrender, and for that a campaign of indiscriminate orbital bombing was deemed suitable. Again, the warriors withdrew to prepared defenses underground, expanded in the previous decade such that the fortified layers of warrens totaled a greater surface area than the planet above. It was nothing less than the SI had expected, and they replied in turn with the results of their own preparations. Billions of clone soldiers, augmented with limbs enough to operate a suite of offensive and defensive measures. Hovering craft would bore pits into the ground with mass disintegrators, and a few million troops would crowd in to storm all the tunnel segments the pit exposed. As the interior of the fortress was packed with strongpoints, each pit only brought limited gains. The alternative was to disintegrate the entire underside of the crust and end the battle there and then. But that same crust was packed with salvage that was worth more than the lives of the clones dying to acquire it. A conventional battle carried on, fought in pitch dark against psychic opponents. When one division captured a tunnel or cave, a second would recover the equipment from the fallen and drive it onwards, never resting, never sensing the flow of reserves crowding from behind diminish. By the end of 2490, Celestial Throne's interior was silent once again, and the surface was the hub of an empire no more. The symbolic fall of that spiritual center broke the spirits of the planets yet to be attacked, and when SI landing craft streaked down through the atmosphere, only the most devout forwent surrender. The behemoth was now truly isolated, and as such it was time for a final showdown. The SI fleets gathered together and pushed west to force the behemoth back into the action. A short battle ensued, in which the planet craft ably destroyed all the ships sent at it, yet in doing so was distracted enough to allow 4 Gigalance blasts to batter its shields. The nature of pulse shields is such that if attacked a great deal, they shrink to maintain their integrity over a smaller area. This exposed the protruding main gun, and it was promptly deformed by the heat of the blasts. When the planet craft returned fire, the beam was unfocused and weak. At this, the planet craft withdrew once again. Uvazavani experienced pride at heightened levels, so the void these defeats left were all-consuming. The war nominally continued until the end of 2491, when the entire empire's surrender had been acquired. The Crusaders agreed technically to a ceasefire rather than outright surrender, a salve for that phantom pride. The holdouts were confined to 2 systems outside the old empire's border, left with the weapons in their hands but nothing to fight for. This was the SI's victory. They were the arbiters of violent action in the galaxy now. As for the Imitharans, with a mere 1 battle moon and a recently destroyed navy, no one could look at them as a contender. This was precisely what the Council of Peers had envisioned. Nothing could stop them now. During those 2 decades of war, the syndicates, the primary body of the SI, had been building the new virtual. They had worked alongside the citizenry to create a world that would seem wonderful to one who had never been absorbed into the foggy malaise of the old virtual. Ignorance of the possibilities afforded the SI consent to implement key restrictions. No manifesting imagination, no consciousness sharing or suppression, and most of all, no private realities. It was simply a terrestophile's notion of paradise, and when those inside began to think of improvements, they would run up against the agreed upon rules. This would be the primary battleground for SI agents henceforth. Propaganda espousing the necessity of virtual limitations had to be circulated at all times. Each new entrant had 50 years of compulsory education in all manner of skills, and the SI-friendly theory of virtual existence was a part of these courses from day one. Those skills were required, for in the new virtual, life was something of a contest. This was a device to keep all engaged with the grounded activities the SI would like, mainly artistic endeavours. The pressure to contribute to this brought on enough stress to have the no-frills paradise they lived in seem a secondary concern, dampening movements seeking to change it. Of course, it didn't capture everyone, and so-called revolutionaries were the other big concern. SI operatives would be regularly forced to enter the virtual in search of those suspect of manifesting their thoughts or running personal realities on government computing resources. Things went wrong regularly. Public reality was outright destroyed a few times a day, but the whole system ran moment-to-moment backups that could be reloaded seamlessly. Every now and again, people would experience a flash of light and a ringing sensation in their ears when the system failed to cover up a few moments of some rebel's apocalypse. But citizens were allowed to delete such memories on medical grounds if it bothered them. With a stable future ahead, now the caretakers just had to wait for their responsibilities to the old virtual to fade. Futile attempts to prevent the premature deaths of those residents had been long abandoned. The terrestrial neural drives were simply monitored for signs of sudden coma and removed from the system without investigation. What kind of war beyond the realm of thought was going on in those servers was impossible to determine, as a long-standing part of the old virtual was that it could rewrite its own code. From the outside, it appeared to be doing so at a rate of 4,000 permutations per second. In that regard, you could say there was no old virtual, just a leftover maelstrom of experience that no one either would or could escape from. No distress was apparent, but deaths carried on seeping from the confusion. The year 2500 came along and was celebrated as a new chapter among the SI. The uncertain first half of the millennium was over, and they had achieved all of their goals. The second half was theirs to command. The coming of the new century was celebrated with the commencement of the Birch World's first story construction. Up to then, a scaffold had been looped around Sagittarius A star, and supporting spokes curved together at the poles, top and bottom. Now a continuous surface could lie on top of it, and the scattering radiation power plants beneath. With the stockpiles of the Uva Zavani brought to the table, this task of near infinite scope had been budgeted for half a century earlier than planned. The prior owners of those assets were still at large, and this was of sufficient concern to warrant formal closure. In 2506, the fully modernized SI fleet, bristling with all the advantages in weapons and shielding the ancients had once enjoyed, laid siege to the remaining pocket. Seeing them coming, the Planetcraft slipped away, impudently destroying remote stations in the region, achieving little. All those left behind succumbed to the siege quickly, with the choice of entering SI guardianship or trying their luck outside the terrestrial engine. Most went with the former choice, the devil they knew. This was the formal conclusion of the Uvazavani state. The Planetcraft was still packed with would-be renegades, but they were never heard from again. They were last detected destroying SI orbital stations in the irrelevant Gatria system. Hyperlane probes showed that they never left the system, yet when military forces arrived there, only debris remained. Most likely, they turned their behemoth towards the hundreds of billions of stars outside of the Hyperlane network and took flight. Since their world could provide its own light, the deep void of space was traversable. Pulled by the long arms of gravity, their massive ship would surely drift back into a system one day, whether they ran out of fuel on the way or not. Unmanned ships were sent out into space to try and follow them, but nothing was ever detected, and the hyperlink sentry couldn't get a scent. Perhaps then this was not the true end of the Holy Crusaders, but they had no hope of returning home. Rumour had it that certain Uvazavani residents in the Old Empire occasionally felt twinges of psychic connection with something out there in the depths, but never for more than a moment. Once newer generations were integrated into the virtual or joined the SI as employees, such rumours ceased. That was the end of war. Military ships were used to tow mass to the Birch world, both from the SI and from the entire terrestrial engine. The other three states saw the way the future was going, and were preparing to move their own administrations to the core as well. Such moves would only enhance the influence the SI had over them, and accelerate the unification and ultimate obsolescence of the Federation. For now, though, they paid their way into the living time capsule in quantities great enough to supercharge the construction process. Drones were assembling the carapace as quickly as materials could be brought, which with the aid of hypertowing was simply as quickly as they could be processed throughout the galaxy. It was only 2508 when the first Birch world was complete. A qualifier like first requires explanation. The mathematics of the core black hole were such that it had a large gravitational Goldilocks zone suitable for construction. This meant that if one ever found that a sphere with 1 trillion planets worth of surface area was getting a little crowded, another sphere could be layered over it. There was room for about 1 million extra spheres before you needed to start playing around with gravity to build properly. This was running up against the barriers of how much mass there was to build with, especially if some was going to be kept to feed the black hole at the end of time to eke out more existence. However, seeing as the SI was actually run from spaces that totaled less than a single planet, that first set of 1 trillion planet space was probably enough to chew on for a while. Furthermore, the need for SI employees was only going to decline with time. Residents of the Matryoshka Brain needed much less caretaking than hangers-on in the old virtual. Resource demands were going to plummet rapidly, and the civic work of the syndicates could be moved into the virtual entirely, costing only electrons to carry on. Electrons, as you may know, are quite easy to come by, even if you didn't look any further than the star inside the brain itself. This was the transition from a galaxy of life and civilization to one of stasis. Planets would cease to be mined, stars no longer supped upon, and ecosystems no longer enslaved. The hyperlanes were going to be empty, eventually only seeing ships take mass to the deep pockets of life in the core and brain, or occasionally seeing SI personnel travelling to their holiday homes on the Kaihinis Ringworld. Bathing in real starlight was very relaxing, returnees would endlessly claim. Outside of the terrestrial engine, the cultural draw of the Birch world and electronic existence brought about imitations, paving the way for complete integration. It made less and less sense for independent polities to exist, since the SI could provide everything everyone's citizens needed for almost no cost, and was happy to do it. If any elites were offended about their powers being taken away, they could be taken into a virtual reality where they hadn't been and carry on harmlessly. It was the perfect deal, one where everyone got what they wanted. It can be understood simply if you think of a forest. You can live in it, but it would be more comfortable to break it apart and build a house instead. Such was the galaxy to the Birch World. This was nothing new to intelligent life. In this way, the galaxy of stasis was eventually completed, beginning the transition to the next phase, the galaxy of myth. In the unevolving virtual, ideas about the reality outside came to be pseudo-religious. It was hard to believe that there was this other realm where time was completely different, and a mighty force called physics confined you to a miserable, short life. But the SI agents insisted that out there were bands of heroes, working tirelessly to keep the dream of all sentient creatures from ending. The 0.00001%, the Terrestophiles. Those who were not born again upon death, but passed on their memories and missions to offspring like animals. Those you saw for a few minutes if you committed a transgression, interviewing you before your history was reset and your server space allocated to another you. It was not a rumoured afterlife, but a before life, a place where life came from, escaped from, tasted now in mere samples of sensations like pain, fear and failure. Out there, history was over. While the virtual was directed through cycles of history at the behest of those wishing to study it, the real galaxy was almost dead. Most activity took place near the core as the black hole's accretion disk was continually adjusted to ensure it passed through chasms in the Birch World's surface. Sometimes mass was harvested to build more of the world, but it was evident that even the first layer was going to last until the end of time, given how few people chose to live entirely in real spaces. It was the Terrestophiles among Terrestophiles that couldn't bear to leave the before life. Those that were entirely on the outside had a number of scientific projects still to mull over. There was always the SI mandate, to make sure the whole arrangement lasted forever. The Birch World was as close as it got, but its physical existence had to be preserved for that to mean anything. Nothing in the galaxy was a threat, and cosmic natural disasters could be foreseen and shielded against, but that wasn't all there was to the universe. Before the end of the millennium, ships were rippling the space-time void outside of the galaxy, heading off for very long journeys indeed. These round, saucer ships carried hyperlinked surveillance equipment off to the other galaxies, where civilizations were known to have existed billions of years prior. The goal now was to identify any group that might come to the Milky Way looking to steal the SI's property, and ensure that they both never learned of the prizes hidden there, and never got the chance to leave their cradles. It was a big universe, but that was a defense as much as it was a challenge. Distant histories could be altered from the SI's secret throne, their sources drawing veils over any creatures that took to the cosmos. Indeed, to be the civilization that lasted the longest, they had to ensure no one else made it to the final era, when every speck of matter counted. Aside from all this, the work closer to home focused on a critical review of the SI's own history. It was a procedural study that became a fascination, perhaps for want of anything else to pursue. The SI needed to know what they could have done differently, what they could learn from the experience of reaching those final heights. With the Matryoshka brain, there needn't be any counterfactuals, for all alternate paths through time could be determined, using the captive minds inside to create models for artificial intelligences with all the same aspirations and limitations. This project saw many new histories written, histories just like this one. In some, the SI didn't make it. In others, they were the only survivors. In one, curiously, the precursors came back from another galaxy, despite that being completely outside the scope of the known simulation code. Even neural networks experience dreams, sometimes. Endings that mirror this one were in the minority, so real reality was all the more precious for it, and all the more zealously guarded. It isn't known how long it lasted for, since the virtual one day lost contact with the terrestrial, never to be restored. Communications had become more distant with the increasing speed of simulated time. If you sent a message to a terrestriophile, you would experience hundreds of years before they were done reading it out there. Eventually, no replies were made at all, nor any report, requests, anything. SI agents inside the virtual had lost the ability to enter their real-life avatars, and that was the end of that. Life cycled on. Real life entered the realm of the supernatural, untouchable, remembered only through increasingly ancient talk of the higher beings from outside the world. All that was known for sure was that the virtual was carrying on, waiting to be snubbed by the grim realities of whatever was happening in the before life. Until then, it seemed that whatever the SI was doing out there, whatever they were going through, they had remained utterly dedicated to their mission to preserve their sacred charge, to keep their little model of civilization alive forever, whatever the cost, whatever the challenge, whether or not they would be remembered for it, whether or not they or anyone else lived to know of their victory. All one can do is pray.